Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're ready to begin tonight's session. Good evening to all of you. Welcome to all of you, ladies, gentlemen, the non-conforming, but especially to the Office of the VC, Faculty of Deans. Unfortunately, our Dean of Students could not be present here today, but we welcome him in absentia as well. All staff that's present here today, the students, of course. Thank you so much for joining us. As you all know, tonight's public lecture is on decolonizing the university and beyond. I'm quite excited about tonight. I first read Prof's work around 2015, and so it's a special night to be here and to share the stage with him today. My name is Ndombovuyo Linda. I will be your program director for tonight's session. So feel free, relax, and please engage in tonight's discussions. As you all know, the university and decoloniality and decolonization has been a particular area of interest, particularly in research globally and, of course, nationally, as we all know, with the national spread of the hashtag #FeesMust4 movement around 2015. At its best, the modern university formulated credible knowledge in favor of a more just society. However, such formulation was premised upon the idea that the goal of social justice could be achieved without cognitive justice, and that's some of the things that we'll be tackling tonight. And this premise is today untenable, as it can be shown that the knowledge produced by the university has legitimized and often actually reinforced social injustice. So the future of the university actually depends on how well it will respond to the emerging imperative that there can be no global social justice without global cognitive justice. The epistemologies of the South and the methodologies they call for will enable the university to give a positive response to such challenges. And as you can see, tonight's program will follow in this particular order. I will be directing Ms. Irna Senekal from the Center for Integrated Post-School Education and Training, SIPSET, will do our welcoming, and she'll sort of give an overview about tonight's discussion and the theme and how we can unpack it. And then we'll have Prof give his keynote address, and then we'll have a respondent followed by a Q&A session, and then we'll have the closing and the vote of thanks. So now I welcome Ms. Erna to come on stage to do our welcoming for us.
Thank you, Ntombovuyo. I was told by Andre very early one morning that he would like me to welcome you, and I think Ntombovuyo has done a very warm welcome already, but I'd like to just say Nam Kile Nonke. Welcome and almal hierso. I'm Irna Senekal, and I warmly welcome you at this public lecture on decolonizing the university. And as I thought about this evening, what struck me is that the pedagogical assumptions of a lecture is based on what Freire would refer to as banking education. It positions speakers as knowledgeable others and us as people to receive this knowledge. And so to quote Freire, and I think maybe to put a starting point to some of the discussion tonight, and since people receive the world then as passive entities, education should make them more passive still and adapt them to the world. And the educated individual in this form of education is then the adapted person because he or she better fits into the world. And so here lies the problem, I think. If there's anything that we should have learned from the social struggles of communities, workers, and students, is that the world we have is not fit for the majority of the people. And education is culpable in some of that, and we needs us to rethink. We face unprecedented overarching crises of unemployment in our country, poverty, inequality, and ecological destruction. And as Vishwas Satkar said, these are civilizational crises of capitalism, and the situation calls for our response. And so tonight, I would like you to subvert the assumptions of the lecture and its colonial conventions of knowledge creation and pedagogy, and instead stand in critical and collaborative dialogue with one another and Professor de Sousa Santos and each other, as we consider what a transformative struggle for a different world and for a university whose educational purpose is aligned to such a world would require from all of us. Thank you.
And shortly then, just to briefly introduce you to Prof. de Sousa Santos. Professor is a professor of sociology at the University of Coimbra, Portugal, and a distinguished legal scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He has earned his LLM and JSD from Yale University and holds a degree of Doctor of Laws honoris causa by McGill University. He's a director of the Center of Social Studies at the University of Coimbra, and has written and published widely on issues of globalization, sociology of law, the state, epistemology, social movements, and the World Social Forum in Portuguese, Spanish, English, Italian, French, German, Chinese, Danish, Romanian, and Polish. His most recent project, Alice, Leading Europe to a New Way of Sharing the World Experiences, was funded by an advance grant of the European Research Council, one of the most prestigious and highly competitive international financial institutes for scientific excellence in Europe. His most recent books in English are The End of the Cognitive Empire, The Coming of Age of Epistemologies of the South, as well as Decolonizing the University, which is what we'll be talking about tonight. So hopefully some of you have actually read that book and will be able to engage in his lecture tonight as well. The Challenge of Deep Cognitive Justice, and If God Were a Human Rights Activist. Epistemologies of the South, Justice Against Epimicide. I'm interested in that. Yeah. So, Prof, welcome. And oh yes, I also just learned that Prof also writes lyrics for rap. So he's quite diverse and dynamic and versatile. So thank you so much for joining us tonight's lecture. We welcome, let's give him a round of hands as we welcome him.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to come for the first time to this university. I've been in South Africa, and of course after the apartheid period, I've been often in South Africa, but not in this university. And I'm very glad to be here, and thank to all of you for being here this afternoon to discuss with me the tasks of decolonizing the university and beyond. I have a wonderful discussion this morning with the students here, and they have a decolonial reading club. And we had a very, very interesting debate. And actually I started a little bit provocative by saying, what do you expect from a white man originally from Portugal that was a colonizer for so many centuries, to tell you about decolonizing the university? Then I, to create my credibility in a way, there were very candid responses to this. It was fascinating for me, a very learning experience this morning. I have to tell them that not only I was part of the, the international struggle against apartheid in this country, but I was in the anti-colonial movement against colonialism in Portugal. That's why I could never come to the colonies, Mozambique, Angola, St. May Prince, Cape Verde Islands, East Timor, because I was part of the anti-colonial movement. So when they became independent, I became to visit them quite often and collaborating with them. because some of my professors were, in fact, my colleagues at the university, and then they became ministers of the new governments in Angola, particularly in Angola and Mozambique and Cape Verde Islands. So we have a story that, you know, there was a kind of a credibility type of strategy, which I think is necessary sometimes. You have to do these kinds of things because we understand that our field is full of quid pro quos, and I think we should be frank and candid about us. And in fact, what I told him is not so much what is important today, is not so much where you come from, but which side are you on the struggle. And I think this today we have unite people behind these struggles. And I start by mentioning in fact, I very often, myself, I've been working a lot on the questions of democracy, and epistemology comes with it. And I wonder whether we live in democratic societies. We live, in fact, in democratic societies, but most people in these societies don't live democratically. That is to say, they have no conditions to enjoy the democratic rights that are promulgated, consecrated in the Constitution. On the contrary, they depend on more powerful people that have a kind of a veto power over their life chances in life. And therefore, they live in a situation which I call social fascism. Not political fascism, which may also be coming in many countries, but social fascism. And I usually say that we live in societies that are politically democratic, but socially fascistic. And all the societies in which we live today probably are of that type, in one way or the other. And therefore, I think that if you are really interested in a democratic, radical democratic struggle, we cannot accept that the democratic game is a small island in an archipelago of despotisms in our society. Despotisms in the family, despotisms in the community, despotisms in the economy, despotisms on the street. So we cannot accept that this island stays out there. But that's what liberal democracy is all about. It, in fact, doesn't aim at democratizing life, social life. In fact, it's only part of our life, the public life, which, as you know, they are trying to consider that is reduced to vote every 4 years. But if democracy is that, it's very little for the lives of all of us and for most people. So what does the university have to do with this? If you are trying to engage the university, and I've been writing extensively about the university, well, I think probably they have, because the way in which our society is organized, many of the ideas have come from the university, from the studies, from the scientific knowledge that is produced in universities, and of course controlled in one way or the other the ways in which our societies are organized. So I think it has to do with that. Probably the poverty of our democracy, the brutal and violent inequalities of our societies as we live now, the grotesque inequality of our societies. This society, my colleague already mentioned to you, and the Gini coefficient of South Africa is one of the worst. It's in 150th place among the countries in the world. That is to say, the disparity between rich and poor is one of the highest in the world. And globally, you can see that this disparity is growing, not only within countries, but also among countries. As you know, the 8 richest men in the world have as much wealth as the half poor of humankind, that is to say 3.5 billion people. So how come that 8 people are so rich? How come that, in fact, there is no commotion with so many things, violent things that happen in our society? For instance, 15 immigrants trying to reach Europe drown in the Mediterranean, which used to be a sea that would unite Europe with North Africa, and now is a liquid cemetery. Well, suppose that these people were European citizens. It would be a major commotion in Europe, my God. 15 of our citizens. Why is that nothing happens in Europe when that happens? Well, because they are not really human beings. They are subhuman. They are Africans, they are black, they are refugees, but they are not really people. They are part of the subhumanity of mankind. In fact, the former minister of Italy, Salvini, said that these boats were cattle boats, bringing people. So that's the way we see the situation now. And then when we see all this and we see that there is no alternative, it looks like there is no alternative to this society. Lots of a sudden, a small adolescent in Sweden, Greta, starts climate struggle and strike all over the world. Why is that? Because I think for the youth in our world, it's become easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. How come? There is no planet B. So if the world goes away, all of us go away. Capitalism is an historical fact. If it had a beginning, it will have an end. But we don't see that. We better imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, of our societies, the way we are organized. So I think there is something wrong with the ways in which we analyze our societies today. And I think that the university is at the core of that. And that's why I title this talk in this way. But at the start, I'd like to say a couple of things to give you the premises of my thinking on this. And the first one is that I'm not very comfortable with the word decolonizing, quite frankly, for several reasons, even though I've been using it, even writing books with that title. It's because decolonizing is a negative task. It's decolonize, it's negative. I'm more and more concerned with what are we going to put in place once we decolonize it. What is left? What will remain? What will replace the things that we are teaching and learning today? Right? So I think that we have to have a more positive approach, and that's why I have been using, and in fact I think I coined it, but that is not important, the idea of the epistemologies of the South. To try to render positively the idea that you have to find an alternative. And the alternative has to be also an epistemological alternative, so that it becomes a social and a political one. So the first idea is that probably decolonizing should be only one part of our task, a very important task. But we have to analyze our societies carefully. And much of the work on decoloniality starts from the assumption that the colonialism was over. And that's the first trap. Colonialism is not over. It's here with us. We live in capitalist, colonial, and patriarchal societies. The three main forms of domination, and I work extensively on these three forms of domination in the book that was mentioned, The End of the Cognitive Empire. They are the three main dominations of our world: colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. And the drama of our time is that the dominations, these three heads of the domination, work in articulation. And the resistance against them is fragmented. That is to say, capitalism does not exist without colonialism and patriarchy. And in fact, when capitalism becomes more aggressive, colonialism becomes also more aggressive, and patriarchy becomes more aggressive. Example. When Bolsonaro president of Brazil was elected and became president, there were immediately lots of measures to make the lives of the poor worse and much more difficult, because some social rights were eliminated, subsidies were eliminated, social policies were eroded, an intention of privatizing education, privatizing the health system, and so on. Capitalism became more aggressive as the politics of Bolsonaro in the last year. Almost at the same time, the genocide of the black youth of the peripheries of Brazil increased. The police brutality against the young kids, black kids, in the peripheries of Brazil increased. That is to say, colonialism intensified. And at the same time, femicide increased as well. In 1 week only, 3 women were assassinated by their partners in Brasilia. And they were not poor women, they were middle-class women. So, the articulation of domination is very clear for me today. And I see it everywhere. And the problem with critical thinking is that it saw only one of these dominations. For instance, Marxism only saw capitalism, didn't see the others. So we have to decolonize our own Marxism, those that are Marxism, as I did, actually, to unlearn Marxism in order to understand the world in which I live. So I think the first thing is to see that while this domination functions in articulation, the resistance is fragmented. Trade unions, socialist parties, communist parties, so many of these political forces have been very much anti-capitalist, but very often they have been racist and they have been sexist. Some of the anti-colonial or anti-racial movements have been pro-capitalist and have been sexist. And some of the feminist movement has been very racist and pro-capitalist. So the resistance is fragmented and domination is articulated. As long as we have this situation, we don't get out of here, quite frankly. So you have to find ways in which the resistance against these forms of domination is also articulated, which is not easy, because we come from a culture in which social movements, organizations, etc., they are thematic. They are in favor of rights of women, they are in favor of land, they are in favor of this, of that. And we don't see the connections between that. We have been trying, as probably some of you know, I was one of the founders of the World Social Forum that met for the first time in 2001 in Porto Alegre, Brazil. Our idea was to bring together all these movements and try to start a conversation among them. And in fact, some advances have been conquered, but what we conquered mostly was the articulation, the global articulation of the same theme movements. For instance, Via Campesina, some of you know, is an organization that unites the peasants all over the world. And in fact, the president of that organization, a dear friend of mine, is a Zimbabwean, Elizabeth Mpofu. Here in Harare, lives in Harare, where I have been often with her. We managed to aggregate the Via Campesina mainly after the World Social Forum. The World March of Women, for instance, is a product also of the World Social Forum. We start getting united. There is an intercontinental articulation of indigenous people, uniting the indigenous people from the Americas with the New Zealand and the Australian indigenous people. So there is articulation between women and indigenous people, between indigenous people and peasants, between peasants and LGBT. Yeah. No, we don't have this type of articulation. So I think that we are at a point in which we have to see the types of knowledge that we engage to understand reality. That's why I've been claiming that we need a new Thesis 11. The older ones in this room that probably have read Marx know what I'm talking about. The Thesis 11 is a famous thesis by Marx He wrote it in 1846 while criticizing a materialist philosopher called Ludwig von Feuerbach, and he wrote several theses against him. And the thesis number 11 says, the philosophers up until now have been trying to understand the world. The problem is not to understand the world, it's to transform the world. Well, I think Marx at the time was right when he said that, but that was also not right now. I think if Marx were here, I think that you would really be convinced that we need a new understanding of the world before you can transform it. So we need really a new understanding, and this new understanding is probably necessary in my view, to take us away from the situation in which we are. Therefore, transformative, so to say. Our knowledge, as is understood today, is not transformative. We may put that name, but reality is against that. So, second premise, as I said, we don't live in post-colonial society, we live in colonial society, and therefore decoloniality is a wrong name, because when decoloniality was invented, it was assuming that colonialism was over. So, we need decolonization and anti-colonial struggles, of course. The third premise is that, are we really in a period of decolonization? Well, quite frankly, I think that we are in a period of recolonization. There are forces, of course, among which I think we are, that wanted the decolonization, but there are many forces that are recolonizing the world. And recolonization is taking place. What is recolonization? It's a mode of interaction, of an equality of power that involves the ontological degradation of some people, some groups. That is to say, people that are not really considered human are considered subhuman. Why is that? Well, first of all, the fact that the three dominations, some people ask me, but why are these three dominations articulated? Capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. For a very simple reason. It took me some time to get to it, but I think now I'm convinced that's the case. The reason is that the free labor, which is the mark of capitalism, does not sustain itself without highly developed labor and non-paid labor. Free labor does not sustain itself without highly developed labor and unpaid labor. Who supplies the highly developed labor and non-paid labor? Colonialism and patriarchy. And therefore these two forms, because they involve the ontological degradation of those performing that labor, is very important for capitalism. You may not see here at the university, for instance, because this development is uneven and combined. The free labor here requires slave labor over there. Probably we are using the Adidas and Snickers and so on. Well, it is being built, most of it, with slave labor. Slave labor is growing in the world. The United Nations says that a labor analogous to slave labor. The adjective analogous is a ceremony. It's ceremonial because, as you know, the United Nations is an organization of states. Since the states eliminated, abolished slavery, we cannot say that that is slave labor. We say that is analogous to slavery. But for those that are under those conditions, the adjective does not count. They are really slaves. And it's growing. It's growing around the world. So I think that this idea that this highly developed labor and the unpaid labor is necessary is fundamental. Many people in the critical thinking, for instance, those that are Marxist, even accept a very stupid distinction that has been really prevalent in the social sciences between productive and reproductive work. We have been used to say that women don't do productive work, they do reproductive work. Is it reproductive to take care of the family, working so hard at home, doing this and that, all this second shift, sometimes third shift? How come this is only reproductive, is not productive? It is reproductive so that it is not paid for, basically. And the knowledge that we have accepted trap, of course, productive labor. So I think that the recolonization is taking place by the ways in which groups of people are treated as subhuman in our world. For instance, you take a mega project, mining project or a dam or a nuclear power plant. Sometimes, whenever, and I just came from Colombia, an harbor is expanding, like Port Elizabeth. But there are thousands of Afro-Colombian people that live there. They have to be displaced. How are they displaced? By violence, of course. By killing, assassinating the leaders. Because they are there and nothing is done if the containers of these large ships that arrive here drop on the floor, and I don't know if you have ever seen, when they drop on the floor is an artificial earthquake, because they're so heavy. And the children are sleeping 50 meters away. So these people live in what we call zones of sacrifice. And very often these zones of sacrifice are justified because of that. We need development, we need mega projects. And there are zones of sacrifice. But usually look at the people that live in the zones of sacrifice, either black or indigenous people, all over the world. Or, of course, untouchable castes, or the Rohingya in Myanmar. People that are not really people, full people, are subhuman people. So we have to understand that these zones of sacrifice sometimes are called collateral damage. That is to say, it happens. For instance, here, very nearby, I'm not giving examples from Marikana or other examples from South Africa, but in Mozambique, a great mining company on coal has been, devastating all the sacred territories of people in the middle part of Mozambique. Well, and they said it's so rich in coal that they don't really care. I mean, they have really to excavate and destroy the communities, and the people have to move to another place. Why? Because it's collateral damage, because we need to do this mining, and doesn't matter the consequences for that. So I think that these are some of the forms of recolonization going on, and probably the most vicious one, and probably the most invisible one to South Africans, is digital colonialism. We are entering a new period of digital colonialism, and I'm really surprised. I have a very interesting debate in Joburg with Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, because he's an enthusiastic of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And it was because I was very critical of that. I said, well, let's have a discussion. And we had a discussion, of course, on this Fourth Industrial Revolution. And what struck me, in fact, was that your president, while was at the summit, talking about leapfrogging into the future, that's the topic now, really was not relying on university papers, on scientific papers. He was relying on papers by the consultancy firms, Accenture, Deloitte, McKinsey. Well, tailor-made for the client, of course. Have any credibility, these companies? Zero today. Why? They didn't predict, none of them predicted 2008 meltdown of the financial system. Because they cannot ever predict the worst possible scenarios. And you know why? Because they go bankrupt. The stakeholders abandon them if they predict the worst scenario. That's why all these documents are between risks and opportunities. And usually the opportunities come out ahead, of course, right? But I don't see any of those here. And I can give you examples of this, that in fact there is a risk here of recolonization. India is the last user of Facebook. The data, as we know, are now fundamental for the new digital world of artificial intelligence and communications in which we are in. But they have to be treated processed in data centers. Where are the data centers for India? Any in India? No. 15 data centers of billions of data, are all of them in the US, in some countries in Europe, and in Singapore. And in fact, recently in Osaka, in a meeting on the free flow of data, of course these companies, Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, they want in fact the free flow of data, because that's their business, of course, to make lots of money with our data. 3 countries voted against that, and South Africa was one of them, and India and Indonesia. They were trying to protect the data generated by their own citizens, because the idea that these data are going to really be used against you, eventually, to introduce you and to control your consumption preferences, your political preferences, as you have seen in many countries. And these data are offered. In fact, they are taken away. It's a kind of a theft of data, but then they are returned to us as free. They treat them. They use big data. They use algorithms. And the problem with algorithms is that all of them are patented. So we don't know how the treatment is done. It's not free access. So I think the recolonization is here, and is here. Why? Because in fact it's going to create a digital divide. If you look at the conditions for the 4th Industrial Revolution, the idea of leapfrogging is very problematic, because all of them force us to ask this question, which is the question of the global chain of value. That is to say, these data are going to create a chain of value. The value is created here and there on all the data, all people that have Facebook, of course, right? But who gets most value, the highest value? Is always concentrated in the countries that have been benefiting from the first, from the second, and from the third revolution. So it's not surprising that they are the ones that are going to benefit most from the 4th Industrial Revolution. Not surprising. But there are some advantages for South Africa. And it's quite tragic what they propose for South Africa is not good news for Africa. What they are trying to say is very subtle, is not so subtle, I'd say, is that South Africa could recolonize Africa. South Africa is the entry point for Africa. It's the most developed country in Africa, after Nigeria, and therefore is entry point. We, in our theories, have developed a concept that is very used by all of us, called sub-imperialism. What they are trying to do is that South Africa becomes a sub-imperial power in Africa. Well, is this a nice future for South Africa? The only country, well, with the Central African Republic, that has no African name, because South Africa is a region of Africa, it's not a name, an African name, as you know. And it's quite interesting that we have always to distinguish Southern Africa from South Africa as a country. It's strange, right? Because this name does not belong. The idea of exceptionalism of South Africa is not even the name, is Africa. So I think that we have to understand that this recolonization is here, and we should be aware of that. Finally, I would like to tell you that we should not be arrogant in our lucidity. Even if you are lucid about the processes that are going on, I think we should be aware of the fact that many ghosts are so familiar to us that we don't see them. So I always wonder, what are the ghosts that I don't see now? That may be boycotting my own work and your own work, and we should really be very attentive to this. Particularly once you enter in this idea that neoliberalism, I know that South Africa also is embarking in a process of privatization, and probably is as you know, neoliberalism is the recipe. Even if the countries go in flames and are destroyed, you know what's happening in Ecuador. That for 15 days, lots of dead people, thousands that are in prison, disappeared people, and all of a sudden the IMF has to stop, because otherwise they destroy the country. But they went to the extreme of trying to destroy a country, to impose a recipe that has been imposed with no results in Tanzania, in Indonesia, in many other countries, in Mexico. The same recipe of austerity policies. So I think that if you really pay attention to a little bit of this, then I would say that one of the things that probably may be most in this recolonization period, see why I'm working on recolonization, not decolonization, so that we can see in the following how we can do that, is that, and our universities can fall into that trap. Increasingly, we say that we live in an information society, right? Do you know that whenever there is a flood, what is the most scarce resource? Potable water. There's lots of water around, right? But the most scarce resource is potable water. In an information society, what is most scarce resource? Potable information. Information that you can rely on. Because you never know today with fake news if we can rely or not in the information that is here. And the problem for us is that the confusion is being created between information and knowledge, as information is knowledge. I can't go much into that in the debate. If you want, we can discuss that. But it is really the machines of the new innovation that is going to lead to the next phase of globalization, probably head by China, nobody knows. Artificial intelligence, the super machines, for instance, dealing with the protein folding, are called deep mind. That is to say, the technology and the machine as a mind, as a deep mind. So the idea that information is knowledge. Well, it's not. Information is description of facts that whatever they are relevant. Knowledge is about understanding and explaining things. Even if a machine managed to decode the secret of life, as they say, cannot explain why the secret is like that. Doesn't make any sense for the machine. So we need knowledge as understanding and explaining. Secondly, information is an internal present. You know, every day you get information, the data about this and that. Tomorrow there are other data. So the present is both eternal and ephemeral. It's the same thing. And this is the contradiction of information. While knowledge is about building bridges between the present, the past, and the future. So I think that we need knowledge, particularly for societies like South Africa, coming to terms with its recent past. I think is dangerous, very dangerous, to replace knowledge by information. So I think that our societies, and probably your society, is not an exception, is divided between two groups of people. The group of people that really doesn't want to remember. These are the people that like information. And then there are the people that cannot afford to forget. Those are the people that need knowledge. So I think that we have to see which side many people are in our societies to understand whether they are just in favor of information or of knowledge. So having this in mind, let's see why I think that we need a new understanding of the world. Because I think that the knowledge that we have produced and taught at universities is the knowledge of the winners of history, never the knowledge of the losers. And by not teaching, not learning, not knowing the knowledge of the losers, we have committed epistemicide, the killing of knowledge. Is a central concept in my epistemology. is that we have really destroyed knowledge. The indigenous people in Latin America were destroyed because their knowledge was also non-knowledge. They were savages. They have nothing relevant to contribute. So the annihilation of people usually goes together with the degradation of their knowledge, the non-consideration of their knowledge as valid knowledge. So I think that's why I've been claiming that there is no global social justice without global cognitive justice. It's not to say that knowledge is, there's nothing anti-science, as I'm going to explain, nor explain that the knowledge are equally valid for everything. Of course they are not. As I usually say, if I want to go to the moon, I need scientific knowledge. But if I want to know the biodiversity of Amazonia, I need indigenous knowledge. So for different purposes, I need different knowledges. So we have to discuss the purposes. So the university, the northern epistemologies that have been dominated have been a knowledge of the winners of history, not the knowledge of the losers. So the epistemologies of the South are an alternative, or offer some understanding that is different from that. Is that it's a set of procedures that try to validate and acknowledge the existence of the knowledge born in struggle. The knowledge born in struggle by those that have been resisting against colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. Because as Hegel told us, for the modern dominant knowledge, knowledge only comes after the struggle, not within the struggle. So after the struggle, the winners are the ones that are there. That's why we teach only the knowledge of the winners. And as long as we do that, we in fact are teaching conformists with capitalist, colonialist, and patriarchal societies. Even if you are critical, or you'd like that they would be rebels, but they will be incompetent rebels, of course. Because in order to be competent rebel, probably they should see the articulations between capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. So I think that if we take this seriously, let's see down what are the premises and then what are the consequences. The premises is that the understanding of the world by far exceeds the Western understanding of the world. The understanding of the world, in fact, is exceptional in many ways. And we should see that it's very important. It has been dominant, as a matter of fact. But it's one of the understanding. And the understanding of the world by far exceeds the Western understanding. So what is wrong with Western understanding of the world is to be taken as the totality of the understanding of the world. And I can explain to you that, in fact, if you do that, the Western, seen as that form, becomes a caricature of itself. And in fact, much of the decolonial thinking, particularly in Latin America, makes a caricature out of the Western knowledge. And once you create a caricature, it's very easy to destroy, right? I'll give you an example. We all of us think that the Western conception of nature is the Cartesian conception, right? Nature as res extensa. Nature as something that we can exploit because it belongs to us. The mines, the land, everything is nature. And therefore has no divine dignity as we have as human beings. So we can dispose of it freely. That's the idea of Descartes. Domination of nature. That's the Bacon's idea, right? So this is the idea that all of us taken as the Western idea. And it is the dominant Western idea. But side by side with that idea, at the same time, another philosopher, a marvelous philosopher, by the way, Spinoza, was offering a completely different conception of nature. Spinoza, in fact, is a Jew from Portuguese ascendancy that was expelled from the country, his parents, and this guy managed to be doubly excommunicated. It was excommunicated by Catholic Church and by the Judaism. Why? Because it said that nature may be those objects, but there is another nature. Nature has a double face. Nature is natura naturata in Latin and natura naturans. Natura naturans is the vital center of life. Nature is the vital center. And for Spinoza, natura naturans is the real concept of nature. And in this sense, it is the vital center of life, is the mother of our life. And therefore, it doesn't belong to us. We belong to her. And therefore, you cannot destroy it, because you cannot destroy our mother. You cannot kill our centers of life. A completely different conception of nature. This conception of nature is very close to the concepts of nature here in Africa. Is very similar to the concepts of indigenous people in Latin America, Pachamama, Mother Earth, the translation, but is not considered Western. Why? Because, of course, the Spinozian conception of nature could never help the colonizers to exploit, to pillage the richness of the New World, of course. They had to have this degraded form of nature, the Cartesian form, to do the colonial pillage of the richness of the resources of these countries, the new countries. Can we imagine that they would do that if they would arrive with the Spinozian concept of nature? They would be there and be respectful for the nature they would encounter. They would never destroy it. There are mountains in Latin America that were destroyed in 50 years. Mountains of gold and silver, Potosi, for instance. It was really a very brutal and violent form of pillage. So that required this form of nature. But this is one form. And we should recover the richness of other forms. So whenever the knowledge becomes dominant, it suppresses the dissident forms of that knowledge. That's why Spinoza was put aside. And that's why Spinoza is today a very esteemed, very well esteemed philosopher. Why? Because the kids are concerned, everyone is concerned about the ecological crisis. And therefore we need a different concept of nature. So all knowledges are systems of knowing, and all systems of knowing are systems of ignorance. Whenever we teach a given knowledge, we are creating ignorance about all the other knowledges. And in our universities, when we have students that come from a diverse background, very often while we are teaching them about certain kind of knowledges, we are forcing them to be ignorant about their own knowledges. So there is no knowing without ignoring. And in fact, when this knowledge seems to be the only valid knowledge, becomes arrogant in its own ignorance. That's why, following a philosopher of the 14th century, Nicolaus of Cusa, I usually say that we should be learned ignorant. That is to say, knowing in fact the limits of our knowledge. I tell you a story because I think it's with stories things go easier. One student of mine, indigenous student in Colombia, she was doing a project with me, and she's indigenous of Quechua origin, and she was going through law school, and she was in the civil law class, and the teacher, first year of the law school in Bogota, and the teacher was telling them about property, individual property, and say, well, there are movable things like this watch, like these things, and there are immovable things like land. But they are all for sale. You can sell them, we can buy them, we can transact. Because all these objects are for commerce. That's what the civil code says. Well, my indigenous student rose her hand at the end of the class and said, Professor, in my community, this does not apply, because in the land does not belong to us. We belong to the land. The professor looked at her and said, well, I'm teaching the civil code. I don't care about what you indigenous people consider in those communities superstitions. And she arrived in my office crying. I said, Professor, what happened? Am I ignorant? Is what my people think a kind of ignorance? And I told her, no, Elizabeth, you will be much better than your teacher, because you are going to learn the law of the Western society, the official law of Colombia, and we are going to be a lawyer, and that's important to defend your country. But you are not going to forget the law ways of your own community, the customs, the ways in which your community, and by knowing them, you can defend them much better. So you are going to have these two kinds of knowledges. Because after all, what is education? Education is expansion of subjectivities. And how do we expand subjectivities? By people, first of all, understanding their own heritage, their own cultural background, and then to reach out to other cultures and backgrounds. If they don't acknowledge their own heritage, their own cultural background, then to teach them other culture is an attack on their self-esteem all the time. So people can only expand if they have respect for their own culture. And then they don't stay with their own culture only. They are enriched with other cultures. But they have to be very serious about their own cultural heritage. This is the knowledge of the losers that we never teach in our universities in general. And that's why you create these forms of ignorance in our society. So I think that there is no knowledge in general, as there is no ignorance in general. People are knowledgeable of certain kinds of knowledge, and therefore are ignorant of other kinds of knowledge. And we should try to see that. And secondly, as I explained with Spinoza and Descartes, all knowledges are plural. Indigenous knowledges, Ubuntu conceptions of life, they are not homogeneous. I had a very interesting debate, a master class, a joint master class with a dear friend of mine, a philosopher here, Mogob Ramos from UNISA, and we have been friends for many years, and we were really trying to understand constitutionalism from the perspective of Ubuntu in his case, and in my case from the perspective of summa causae, which is an indigenous concept that has some similarities with Ubuntu. And it was very interesting. We could communicate across different cultures because we know the limits of each one's understanding. And if you really know the limits of it, then it is possible to have a conversation if you are on the same side of the struggle, that is to say, if we are on the side of those that are fighting against colonialism, against capitalism and patriarchy. Does it mean that science should be thrown away? Never. I'm a social scientist. And I think that it is very bad when some decolonial thinking takes a kind of an anti-science stance. I learned this from a great liberator of Portuguese colonialism, Amilcar Cabral. Amilcar, in all his presentations for training of cadres and so on, always said the knowledge of the colonizer is not to throw away altogether. We have to be selective. There are parts of that knowledge that are useful to us. So let's keep them. And then throw away whatever they did just to suppress us. And in fact, I think that's the only way that you can do. Science has to understand that it is rigorous, not questioning, but that is not the only form of knowledge that exists. What is wrong with science is to consider that it is the only rigorous knowledge in the world. And it is not. So there are different, and I'm going to elaborate in the second part a little bit of this. But first, let's try to tell you why I'm so concerned about this and the university. Because we are at a bifurcation moment. We today around the world, and I lecture in several universities around the world, I have to tell you something. University capitalism is taking over the universities. It's transformed the universities into business corporations if they can. And everything is about ranking, everything is about publish or perish, and impact studies and quantification. Nobody cares about the quality of research, only the quantity. Right? And so this is part of a commodification of knowledge, because in fact they want to transform knowledge into commodify. They want to know that University Nelson Mandela, if they want to import, to buy franchise, a sociology course of Harvard, of Yale, we have to know the ranking of Yale and the ranking of Nelson Mandela to set the price. That's why there are ratios. Because it has been discussed at the World Organization of Commerce Organization, the free procurement of and free flow of liberation of educational services. So you can buy, instead of training your philosophers, buy a philosopher course from a very good global university that is higher in the ranking. How much do we are going to pay? Depends on your ranking. So that's why there are rankings that qualify and disqualify, quantify, disqualify, whatever is not possible to quantify. Even if it is happiness or the sense of life or the meaning of life, it's not quantifiable, is disqualified. And in fact, today, for a professor to succeed very often, we are engaged in a kind of a mafia, because we are forced, all of us, to publish in English, even if you are, as I am not, a native of English. In 97 of the journals in English are owned by 3 companies, Springer, Francis and Taylor, and Elsevier. And these people control our production completely. So we are the free university knowledge at service of 3 enterprises. And moreover, they have created systems, what I call the Tinderization of knowledge. That is to say, you tweet on my article, you cite my article, you say that you like it, and I say, I'll respond that I like your article. So people are now, seriously, in the United States, people are exchanging likes about their articles, comments. And then, therefore, an article is very important because it became viral. This is absolutely stupid. But that's what is happening. And say, no, in South Africa will never happen. Well, be careful. So I think the bifurcation is this, is that for the first time, the university, it is interesting that when we discuss universities in Africa, people only look at the modern universities that were brought by the colonizers. They never know that the first universities in the world were African universities. They call them pre-modern universities. You know that the first universities were Timbuktu in Mali, what is Mali today, and Al-Azhar in Egypt, 9th century. Well, Bologna, the first university, European university, is 11th century. My own university is 13th century. So they are old, but these ones were much older than that. Why don't we disqualify that? So we start by mutilating our trajectory, erasing our own histories in order to fit a model that is a global model. So for the first time, in spite of the fact that the universities have been so resilient, for the first time, I think that the question is not so much the future of the university, it's whether the university has a future. Because it may become a business enterprise. And if it becomes a business enterprise, I'm sure that Accenture or Deloitte do much better than we do. Because we are now witnessing this division at the universities, everywhere. And I see, I live in 2 worlds, in a sense. My university in Portugal, which is much less involved in this, and Madison, Wisconsin, for the past 35 years. All the time, new departments of nanotechnology, technology, biotechnology, computer science, all buildings all over medicine. Closing down, sociology, not yet, but literary studies, ethnic studies, comparative literature, all the market, all the values that are being evaluating knowledge. That is to say, in our universities, we are witnessing a distinction between knowledge that has market value and knowledge that has no market value and should have no market value. Can you imagine philosophy having market value? But in fact, these departments are underfunded and the other departments are superfunded. So the magnitude of our task is such that I'll be briefly now to see what is the alternative. The alternative is this. Well, as I see it, my proposal. If you take seriously that societies are, that's what the premise of the epistemologies of the South, that we live in capitalist, colonialist, and patriarchal societies, there is a key concept for this. It's the concept of abyssal line. Our societies are divided in two. And there is an abyssal line because it's invisible. It's so radical that we don't see it. Is the society divided between what I call the metropolitan society and the colonial sociability. In the metropolitan sociability, we are equal. We have rights. We may be discriminated against, but we have means of defense. On the colonial side, we are subhumans. And our societies are divided in this way. And we don't acknowledge this because our social theories, our theories are universal. But they are based to erase this abyss, a line. But the abyssal line is a lived experience of many people today. A woman that works in a restaurant, she lives in the metropolitan society, she works in the metropolitan sociability because she's a worker and she has rights. When she goes home, very often she crosses the abyssal line and may be assassinated by the partner or may be victim of a gang rape. The young black student that is at university in Brazil or in anywhere part of the world may be in the university, in the metropolitan sociability, the civilized, the protected sociability. But when this young man or this young woman crosses and goes outside, he may be considered suspicious by the police, revised by the police, surveilled by the police, beaten up by the police, as it happens. And for instance, in Brazil, I know very well in many other countries. So it goes from the human side of life to the subhuman side. There is no humanity without subhumanity in our societies. And I really have to say that I think that the abyssal line is locating itself. And more people are treated as subhumans than they were probably 10 years ago. Because this domination is becoming more intense. So the abyssal line creates, I'll give you an example, 19th century, the end of 19th century. All of us celebrate in Europe, there are people here that probably know that finally labor is protected. It is Bismarck that creates the first unemployment subsidies. So the worker starts being protected. The strikes are being legalized. Labor becomes a right, the labor rights. And it's very celebrated throughout. And you go to your law school, and your law school teaches you about this. What they don't teach you is that at the same time, at precisely the same time, the same countries were legislating about shibalo, about forced labor in the colonies. So protection of labor in one side, forced labor on the other side, at the same time. But this is not visible. This is an abyssal line. It's not visible. People don't see because they are working in the metropolitan side. They don't see the colonial side. So you have to understand that this subhumanity is being recreated all the time. And this creates what I call the sociology of absences. The destruction of knowledge, the things that happen on the other side of the line are not valuable. But when we recognize that the abyssal line is there, Then we move to what I call the sociology of emergencies. Then we start seeing other experiences of life. When people tell me that there are no alternatives in the world, I say, no, we don't need alternatives. I work 50% of my time is with social movements. In South Africa here, I'm a bit unbalanced because I was going to have a meeting with the Czech dwellers movement, Abahali, and the president got sick and we couldn't get the meeting because we have been working together through a good friend of mine here, Tsepom and Ligozi. So if you go outside into the struggles, you see people resisting. So we don't need alternatives. We need an alternative thinking of alternatives. That's what we need. So this alternative thinking moves in this direction, and it will be the last part of my lecture. Then in the dialogue we can elaborate a little bit of that, because there are two principles. The metropolitan sociability is regulated by attention. The tension is between social regulation and social emancipation. The colonial sociability is run by attention, but is between appropriation and violence. So these are the two sides of the same coin in society in which we live. So if you take seriously the emergencies, then you can see that in order to acknowledge this diversity of the world, we have to move from what I call the monocultures of our culture, of knowledge, to ecologies. And I distinguish 5 monocultures. The first monoculture is the monoculture of rigorous knowledge, science. I think that we have to understand that there are different ways of knowing, and they should be respected. And some of them are limited because they have not developed enough, but sometimes they are limited because they cannot understand beyond certain things. For instance, scientific knowledge cannot understand spirituality. One thing that we do to our students, particularly from indigenous or black origin, is that for them, the ancestors are part of their lives. They think their communities live by their ancestors also. It is impossible in the Western understanding to understand how a dead person could be living, because we are binary. I tell you another story that may be instructive to you. I was doing research also in the mountains of Colombia, and the Minister of Environment came to visit the indigenous community. They were in circles. They usually, the chiefs meet in circles, and they explain all the advantages of the mining that was coming to that community. Because with the mining, with oil drilling, it will come hospitals, schools, hospitals and everything, roads, so all kinds of advantages. At the end of his talk, he said, well, what did you think about this good news? There was a deep silence. Nobody spoke. And the minister said, mentioned to his secretary on his side, said, did I say something wrong? No, minister. He said, nothing wrong. We were saying that it is very good, very, very, very beneficial to the community. He asked again, please tell me something, what do you think? Silence. Well, the guy was becoming a bit nervous, right? And then probably the oldest chief noticed that and rose his hand and said, well, Minister, we listened to you very attentively, very respectfully, but we cannot decide before consulting our ancestors. The minister looked at them and said, well, but your ancestors are dead. What can they do for you? No, Minister, our ancestors are here with us. I don't see them. They are here with us. The minister, already a little bit irritated, said, well, if they are there, consult them then. No, Minister. We can only consult our ancestors after the rituals, specific rituals, and in the full moon. The minister said, well, we are joking. You don't want to talk to me. My helicopter cannot fly at night, and I'm going back to Bogota. The next day, the newspapers in Bogota said the indigenous people refused to talk to the minister. Wrong. The indigenous people didn't refuse to talk to the minister. They wanted to talk in their own terms, according to their own culture. You couldn't really figure it out. That's why you cannot understand that the river may be sacred, but the indigenous people and peasant community don't know that very well. New Zealand just promulgated a law that grants human rights to a sacred river of indigenous peoples in New Zealand. Now, I'm not talking about Latin America. And the opposition came to the Prime Minister, a young woman, as you know, in New Zealand, and said, Prime Minister, this is crazy. Giving human rights to a river? River is a thing, is an object. It's not a person. Cannot be a subject of human rights. They don't have legs, they don't have head, they don't have arms. Oh, no body. And the Prime Minister responded. And the business company has head and arms and legs, but the business company is a juridical person. That is to say, we fictionalized long ago that the business enterprise is a person. Why not a river? Because it's not our culture. You see, so that's the limits. If in order to understand that, we have to understand one part, engage one part of my work, which is intercultural translation. We have to translate these two worlds with the idea that never complete transparency is possible, but not total opacity. It is possible to understand that there are other views. So the ecology of knowledge is fundamental, but there is a second monoculture, the monoculture of differences that hide hierarchies. In the Western thinking, there is no difference that does not hide an hierarchy. Man and woman, white and black, nature and society. There is always an hierarchy. I think we have to struggle for differences without hierarchies. Because black people and white people, they don't want to be equal in all considerations to the white people. Black people have their own history, they have their own trajectories, they have their own culture, but they want to be equal at certain levels. So that's why I've formulated probably what could be a meta-human right for our society, intercultural societies. We have the right to be equal when difference makes us inferior. But we have the right to be different when equality trivializes us. If you take that seriously, we could have a balance between difference and equality. That would be another ecological thing. The third monoculture is the monoculture of the scale. We somehow, in the Western culture, think that whatever is universal is more important than whatever is particular. Whatever is global is more important than whatever is local. Why? Is it possible to find things that are universal? What is an universal thing, according to the Western conception? Universal is anything that is valid irrespective of the context. We call this European universalism. Don't you notice the oxymoron here? The oxymoron? Because if it is European, it's not universal. If it is universal, it's not European. So there are traps in our language like this. But if you go to the people in Maricanas, you go to the mining companies here, to the countryside in South Africa or Latin America, you know that the peasants know that globalization occurs locally. They don't make the distinction between the global and local, because the contamination of their water is by a big company from Canada, a gold company, or whatever. Globalization happens locally. So that's another ecology. The fourth monoculture is the monoculture of linear time. The idea that the time is an arrow. The guys that go in front are developed, the guys that go in the back are underdeveloped. You know why development was created in social science? For most of the population of the world to be considered underdeveloped. You know that when development was created, only 5 countries were developed? Can we imagine a sociologist in Bangladesh or even in South Africa to create that concept as a key concept for the social sciences? in which most people in the world are in the wrong side of history because they are underdeveloped. And they are underdeveloped not just because the economy is less developed. Their customs, their ways of being, their religion, their institution, everything is underdeveloped. Second implication, if you want to be developed, you have to follow the same line. That's why in Bandung in 1955, some new emerging countries from India, from also Yugoslavia, Nkrumah was there too, Suharto, these people and liberation movements from the colonies got together in Bandung in 1955 to say, well, we want really develop, but we want our own development in our own ways. And we don't want to be neither capitalists nor socialists, Soviet socialists. That's why you have a form of socialism in Kwame Nkrumah, of course, and Julius Nyerere. So they were trying to get an autonomy, a relative autonomous way. Well, this was lost with neoliberalism, when neoliberalism took hold. We don't have leaders in any part of the world capable of thinking big. They think small, and usually they think with their pockets in mind. And when they think with their pockets in mind, means that corruption becomes endemic. So I think that this is the fourth monoculture that has to be replaced, because most people in the world don't follow the linear type. Talk to your peasants here, to the people in rural sides of South Africa, to your parents sometimes. Do they have a linear conception of time? They have a circular or spiral conceptions of time. The linear time is very exceptional, but it's dominant. Finally, the monoculture of productivity. Why do we consider that only the productivity is measured by cycles of production? One cycle in agriculture, one day of life. Are we productive or not productive? Well, before the invention of insecticides and pesticides, the conceptions of productivity of land were completely different. And if you talk to your parents, the younger ones that are in the countryside, if they have any experience of the land, they know that the land, the productivity of land is always measured by a given number of cycles of production, because the land has to rest. So we cultivate this area, next year we cultivate another area, because the land has to rest, as we have. But now everything is measured in one cycle. And land is considered productive if we, of course, with the insecticides, with pesticides, become more productive. And we take pills, Red Bulls, and everything to work 24 hours a day. It's the same concept of productivity. So can you see that if we move from the monocultures to the ecologies, we can see the diversity of the world, the different conceptions. And these conceptions are the ones that can bring you a broader view of the world, a more diverse landscape. Of course, this is crucial for the university, because if the university is serious to teach about the ecology of knowledge, it is not enough to go to the community. It has to allow the community to come inside the university. Today, for instance, in some countries in Latin America, in medical school, they allow the traditional healers to teach the students. Because, the World Health Organization already said that traditional medicine in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, is very good for chronic diseases, not good for acute conditions, but for chronic conditions. So they teach the students. And also the people that administer law in the communities, the local laws, the traditional laws, are also taught. And there is always a non-romantic view of the other. That's fundamental for you. Please don't take ecology of knowledge as if I were romanticizing the other knowledge that is not scientific. No. All knowledges have different versions. And some of the knowledges, non-Western knowledge, are very despotic, very corrupt. Look at the struggle of the feminists here in this country, which is a very interesting, and I have followed very closely because I run a project in Europe in which
South Africans were very involved, colleagues from South Africa, the feminists that are completely against the traditional laws and customs because they are male chauvinistic and they refuse them all the way, and the others, they have to try to change it from the inside. And it's, the same happens with Islamic women, the ones that really, to get liberation, refuse Islam, and others that really try to transform Islam from the inside. And in fact, if you go to the Quran, there are lots of surahs in favor of the equality of women. But the problem is that that has not been the dominant view. So you can see that then the community could be more with the university, because why the university isolated itself from the community? Because it had the favor of the elites. But now the elites of your country, as of my country, the very rich people, they don't trust the South African universities or the Portuguese universities. They are sending their children to the global universities in the UK and the United States. Sometimes from the high school onwards. They don't trust our universities anymore because there is no national project. What they have to understand is the global economy. South African economy, what is this? What percentage of the global PIB, the GDP, is very poor. So the elites are training for the world, not for your country. So that's why the universities now run the risk of being underfunded all the time. So I would go on, but now you have to read my book and buy books if you want to pursue this, because then there are all kinds of consequences. How do we teach? How do we know with? How do you do methodologies that are not extractivists? Because if there are people in sociology or in social science or psychology, they know there are extractivists. They go to the community, they interview people. What is that? It's extraction, like a mining company. Because we don't really, no, it's curious. It happened to me, no, it doesn't happen to my students because I learned enough. Is that we don't consider that como knowledge. This is information. Knowledge is my knowledge. You give me information. And when the person, poor person, sometimes is, starts talking about their children, about debts, and about her husband that had beaten up and so on, we say, my dear, it's not relevant for my research because we are focused on that topic. This is extractivism. And that's why we have to do away with that. So in my work, I talk a lot about collaborative methodologies, and this would be other other types of research, and of course oral knowledge would be very central to our universities, and the arts would also be central to our worlds, because I have discovered, that's why I work with rappers, the artists that come from the other side of the line very often are the ones that describe in a much better way the abyssal line, the division between humanity and subhumanity. That's why if you want to see the protest songs of the 70s, in many countries, probably now they are located in rappers, before they become industrialized, of course. I learned a lot from Kanye West and from Jay-Z, but in the 80s, when they were critical. Now they are conservative and business people. So having said that, I conclude by saying struggle, experience, and body are the great contexts within which we have to teach. And these are bodies that, concepts that have been outside our universities. We have to find a new relationship between reason and the senses, because the Western knowledge is created against the senses, because the body is an obstacle to knowledge, while in fact all knowledge in struggle is corporeal. And the feminists know that very well. So I think that we have to bring the body within our conversation. Well, everything that I tell you probably will sound as utopian, but the alternative is myopia. Thank you. What?
Can you please take a seat?
Oh yeah, take a seat.
We're going to have a Q&A session.
Okay, good. The protocol here is very rigid, Universal Mandela. So.
receiving orders to sit down.
Thank you so much, Prof. Santos, for that very intriguing discussion.
I'm sorry, you made me nervous, so I even forgot my language.
We need to decolonize the space. Right. So, something that really stood out from your talk and your lecture was in the beginning when you said it's not so much where you come from, but where you stand in the struggle. And a lot of people who know my intellectual work know that I often talk about the bodies, and that's what you mentioned, you know, when you're just finishing off. We often talk about decolonizing the mind, but I always say parallel to that is a deconstructing and an unlearning of how the body is scripted, right? According to race, ethnicity, gender, class, we know this. And Prof, you also talk about this in some of your work where you say, you've theorized an organizing of the bodies into the zones of being and to the zones of non-being. And I thought you were going to actually mention that today. But I guess in some ways you made some sort of references to it. And then you also talked about colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy as being, well, I say the three monsters which dominate our society. And I found that very interesting. And at the center of these three dominations, you said, is highly paid labor and unpaid labor. So I'm sort of just summarizing for those who may have missed Prof's sort of lecture in the beginning, and where the domination sort of functions in articulation. And then bringing it back to tonight's theme, where that articulation is often found and validated in the corridors of the university space, right? In the conference rooms, in the university space, in the lecture rooms, and so on. And so you also said that we need to have a new understanding of the world before transforming it. And that's where the university is at the center of producing these different forms and different ways of understanding the world. And then you said exclusion on the basis of identity is based or reinforced by exclusion of different forms of knowledge. I found that to be very profound, and that's why I always advocate for the use of intellectual history in African studies, so that we can sort of rediscover the history of African ideas on how we understand economics, governance, leadership, gender, and so on, to sort of recover, as you had mentioned, the riches of other forms of knowledge. But also, Prof, I always find it interesting in how we define or how we label knowledge from the West versus knowledge from the non-West, right? How the language we use to describe knowledge from the West. I'm also glad that you spoke about it. You said that the traps in our language is always pronounced as an alternative, right? So we have this theory, Western theory, versus African wisdom. We have Western societies, like these big societies and nations, versus African communities. So even in the way we have these discussions, I pick that up a lot as well. Science versus indigenous knowledge systems. Intellect versus superstition. So when we talk about African intellect, we often say it is superstitious, or it's superstition. So yeah, thank you so much for that stimulating and intriguing discussion and talk. And now we have an opportunity to open the discussion up. Unfortunately, though, we don't have a lot of time, so we are going to keep the Q&A short. But before then, we have a respondent, Prof. Enver Motala, who is an adjunct professor at the Center for Integrated Post-School Education and Training, which is CIPSET, who will sort of give his response to your lecture.
Well, thank you very much, especially to you, Professor Sousa Santos, for this really extraordinary lecture discussion. My own view, honestly, would be to use this productively. We should really not have this kind of arrangement. There should be a discussion about the implications of what we heard today. What are the implications for teaching, for research, for engagement, for the mandate of the university? That's what I think should really be organized. If it's not going to be, if it's not now, because now you have me as a respondent, but actually the proper thing to do would be to take into account the many very, very fundamental ideas that were shared with us to see what exactly it means for how to reconstitute the life of a university. I'm going to make 4 points, because that's not what's going to happen tonight, what I'm suggesting. And although one could speak at great length about all the issues that were touched on by Professor Santos, I know because of time it's important to say a few things and leave the rest to all of you to mull over. And I would like to urge that you read his writings. There is an extraordinary body of intellectual work which is available publicly and should be studied, and I urge lecturers to include it in their syllabus, and those who are engaged in study groups to read it in study groups, and those who are engaged with social movements and organizations outside the university to use this very rich cornucopia of fundamental ideas, ideas which bestride a range of philosophical concepts, political ideas, ideas which relate to cultural questions, knowledge issues, etc., etc., extraordinarily wide. The 4 issues I want to raise is that what exactly is the reason why, despite the extraordinary body of empirical, theoretical, and experiential evidence about the kind of dystopic world we live in, why is it, despite we know this, if you study the data relating to children's health, to food available, to inequality, to poverty, all of this data, by the way, is available in the public media. I mean, just 2 days ago, fairly decent study on levels of poverty in this country and the number of children going to bed hungry every night. The amount of knowledge we know about the use of scientific, of science to promote war, to create universally dystopic systems. Despite all of that, despite this mountain of evidence, this avalanche of real detailed empirical data telling us that we are increasingly moving towards an unconscionable world structured by people, by relations of power, based on greed, consumerism, and the worst antisocial values and belief systems. Despite that, there is a coyness in intellectual circles, in academia, to name this thing for what it is. A coyness which sometimes you hear, when you do say these things, you are accused of promoting a kind of totalizing conception of the world. Well, the totalizing comes from the dystopic world. There is a totalizing taking place right now, globally. I recently read Pankaj Mishra's Age of Anger, in which he describes for you how in the late 19th century, a young Italian by the name of D'Annunzio, with a band of his followers, seized hold of a little town called Fiume in the south of Italy. And there he began developing his ideas about a fascist world, including, by the way, the stiff arm salute, the swastika, and so on and so forth. Of course, he was lionized by Mussolini, and even Hitler regarded him as a very strong founder. In his book, in Mishra's book, he talks about the huge debates that took place in the 19th century. Well, the really quite foundational debate between Rousseau and Voltaire, in which Rousseau is critical of the ideas of a post-Enlightenment liberal society, liberalism, partly because of its power to destroy, to colonize the world, and its provenance in slavery, by the way, which is, for me, might be the fourth leg of the problems of the globe. So he explains that we have now arrived at an age of anger. Anger because of the failure of the liberal project, the liberal democratic project, global failure. Well, I am actually even more alarmed than Mishra is, because I can hear the unerring voice, the slow rumble of the re-emergence of fascist ideas as a global phenomenon. Bolsonaro, Modi, Erdogan, Netanyahu, and of course, in the great democracy, United States, Trump. And I don't know about this Britisher. What I'm hearing is the unerring voice, the rumble that says to us we are entering an age of terror, not an age of anger. Mishra talks of an age of anger. No, I think it's an age of terror. Terror on the poor of the world. Because that is what's happening. Terror on the environment. Terror based on a reconfiguring of patriarchal forms of dominance. The reemergence of slavery, of human trafficking, which is slavery. Now, all these egregious characteristics which face us today in the world, we in academia are coy. We refuse to name them. Why? Because they are totalizing if we say that. Well, I'm afraid from an analytical point of view, from the point of view of our role in universities, which is supposed to be an intellectual project of critique, because science is supposed to be that, we are failing completely, because we are fiddling while Rome burns. That's what we're doing. I think that that's where the challenge lies for universities. Is it continuing to be complicit in the reproduction of the global power relations which are destroying human lives at the rate at which they are, and the planet? Are we going to continue to be complicit in it? Because we are too concerned about the sensibilities, the institutional structures, and the diverse points of view that we might offend against. There is no problem, really. We should really take Professor Sousa's, Santos's underlying assumptions and submit them to critique. No problem. Absolutely. I'm sure he'll have no problem. I have no problem whatsoever in saying that even the ideas I'm espousing must be submitted to critique. That's what the university's job is all about. And if it is somehow found that actually this is an exaggeration of the reality that faces the great majority of the world, well, then of course let that be a considered scholarly judgment. You see, I think we continue to produce graduates by the millions globally. The Chinese are threatening 10 million per year. We probably have several hundred million graduates since the since the onset of neoliberalism. And the world has become immeasurably worse, despite this fantastic accumulation of PhDs. So it says something about us, about what we are doing. I see Andre saying to me, time's up. Well, let me then make just one more point. The idea of decolonization is not simply about an endogenous process of the restructuring of the university or of the demographic character of the university or of the things that preoccupy the way in which an institution is structured and shaped and so on and so forth. Nor is it about how and what knowledge from within the framework of the existing scientific knowledge, how that is reorganized within an existing framework, within an existing epistemological framework. The university has to take on the responsibility of developing a relationship between science, society, and democracy. And an inward view of the challenge it faces in regard to the production of knowledge, because that's what it is. It is a factory for the production of knowledge, increasingly a managerial factory, increasingly a neoliberal factory primed to support a consumptive global ethos. That's what it is becoming. But the question that the universities have to think about is what knowledge? Whose knowledge? The epistemological question is sometimes confused. It is suggested like the debate is about, well, what's the provenance of global knowledge? Yeah, it's not just Europe, Western Europe. It's, you know, the Chinese had the compass 2,000 years ago. Somebody else had the, and there's a dispute, by the way, even about Pythagoras' theorem, where its origins are. There's a dispute even about the zero. The Indians seem to think it comes from them, but actually there's some evidence suggesting that it might be Mesoamerican. So, and you know, the funny thing is, neo-fascists like the Modi government are trying to appropriate science for fascist causes. Science, you know, if you read Meera Nanda's critique of science in saffron, you'll see exactly what I mean. So the charge that we face in universities is to start understanding the wide diversity of the origins of knowledge, of the kinds of knowledge, of the criteria for knowledge, for the way in which knowledge can be defended outside the conventions of reductive and scientistic approaches to knowledge. Because those approaches to science have very little to do with society, except to extend the dystopia which is now becoming global. Thanks very much.
We will have to allow at least some responses here from the audience. One round. I know that. I'm so sorry for we seldom run over time like this, so my apologies. But do manage the responses because I do think that we have had some great input here. Okay.
All right, comrades and colleagues. So we'll have one round of questions. Unfortunately, that's all we have the time for. Just make sure that you keep your questions nice and brief, and then we'll try and go back to Professor Santos to respond. So can I have some hands? That's perfect, actually. Okay, so I'll see. 1, 2, 3, Susie. 3, 4, good. 5. I think that's enough. Yeah. So in that order.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Asana Koyo. Prof, you spoke about the process of recolonization. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about foreign direct investments. Foreign direct investments are, amongst all other things, yes, amongst all other things, they're regarded as a resource transfer because they allow the exchange of information and technology. So I'm thinking whether if foreign direct investments are a form of foreign direct invasion and are a vehicle of the modern day economic colonization. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is David. Prof, I just wanted, actually I'm from Zimbabwe, so I'm trying to speak from that experience, and I take a sort of like an Orwellian view of how things are going, especially with relation to universities. And I think there are many scholars like Orwell who've argued a position whereby the leaders who push for issues of decolonization actually in the end become imperialist themselves. So I'm thinking of this factor in the university setup, whereby the university has sort of centralized the decolonial project, let's say, amongst certain intellectuals. The intellectuals have become holders of this knowledge of decoloniality. And do you think that we are sort of putting our foot in fire because we are creating a position whereby those same people or the same universities are actually going to become projects of imperialism, even though they are preaching the issue of decolonization? Because especially if you look at it from the perspective of Zimbabwe, you had a government that pushed decolonization, but then in the end they're still pushing that idea that there is decolonization happening, but actually people are being plundered, just as Orwell has wrote about it, let's say in 1984, Animal Farm and all those writers. Yeah.
Just
okay. Okay, thank you. I just have a bit of a comment. It's quite impressive that NMU, I think, has, it's quite impressive that NMU has conferences like this quite often, talking about decolonizing the institution, because this is certainly not the first one. But I think if we want to do the practical work of decolonizing institutions, something as simple as tonight, this is a public lecture, right? But it's in English. Why isn't there at least one translator to translate into Xhosa, which is the Eastern Cape language, in a public lecture? And how does NMU still not have a language policy? Or maybe it does and it's not being implemented, because currently my students are submitting their essays, their semester essays for philosophy. And I want to say to them so badly, many times, that you can actually submit in your own African language. But I'm not able to do that because I don't have the capacity to mark Xhosa essays because I'm Motswana. I can only mark Setswana essays. So affording Botswana opportunities to submit in their African language is a bit unfair, right? So how do we still not have markers who can mark essays and work in African languages, but we have conferences like these that speak to the complexities of decolonizing institutions of higher learning?
I'm only laughing because this makes sense in my head, and I'm not sure if it's going to make sense to you guys, but... So, Prof, we have a public lecture on decolonizing, right? I feel like people come here for this lecture of decolonizing, and they preach to the same people. Like, I'm not seeing the VC and her council. I'm not seeing the Dean of Students. I'm not... If they're here, you can raise your hand and say I'm lying or something. But I think, like, in terms of decolonizing, it can't start with us. It has to start with the people who have the power to effectively put it into plan now, because next year someone else is going to come, Prof, trust me, and he's going to say the same thing. But now you're preaching to us, the people who might have the power in the future, while the people that we give power because we give them this power, they must understand that they have this power because of us. And if we want to, we could take it away. It could take long, but we can take it away. So it does disappoint me that none of the decision makers in this institution, or if they are, there may be two minimum. Yeah,
they are. So
yeah.
Okay, so basically my problem is it doesn't start with this crowd that's here. It starts with people who are bigger than us.
My first question was partially covered by the comrade that commented there, because my first question was, or rather a comment that the humanizing pedagogy that NNMU is some sort of embracing. We just want to see it more practically. But there's this one, the second one, because my question were in the twofold. We are sitting here nicely, here, all of us, but some of young people who try to shake the culture of colonialism are languishing in jail. The likes of Kanya, Ngegeshe, and Bunginkosi Kanyile in Durban. But from our intellectuals, we don't hear them articulating on their behalf, because we must hear more people talking that we can't have young activists languishing in jail for a very good cause of fees must fall. So we must just try to pat ourselves at the back and try to articulate on their behalf, because they are not among us. They are not allowed to engage. And our Prof and everyone else, our doctors must plead in their case. They must write very good articles on their behalf, because they cannot be with us and state their cases.
Can I please invite Prof. Keat to answer some of the institutional questions, maybe, after Prof. has responded?
In fact, I literally don't want to take away from the contributions of the two speakers.
Okay.
Was sitting here the entire lecture. You just left because there's a student award ceremony. You all know about that, and that space as well. And I actually don't think that's a worthwhile argument to engage in. You know what I'm saying? I think that the two speakers there, in terms of what's on the table, it's much more productive for us to engage.
Well, I don't know, my colleague probably want to answer as well. It does so. Well, the 5 questions are very important questions, of course. The first one on foreign direct investment, it depends. I mean, we cannot confuse capitalism with colonialism. There's to say, capitalism is in itself a mode of domination that may not involve in itself, as an ideal type, ontological degradation. Becomes colonial whenever the conditions are so super exploitative that are degrading ontological the other. That is to say, they are not being treated as equals, so to say. And many of the foreign direct investments, particularly today, have this type of idea. In kind of financial capital is very clear. I mean, the ways in which the interest rates operate globally is that the idea of the country and the risk of the country, if you analyze by the different companies what is the country risk, the concepts that go into that concept are not just investment-oriented economic ones, are racist very often, are prejudices about the type of work. The people don't work, the people are indolent, the people are too lascivious, all these kinds of prejudices that makes capitalist rentability with the colonial understanding of the other. But we have to, analytically, we have to understand the moment in which, in fact, this degradation takes place. We know that foreign direct investment comes because salaries are very low, and therefore, and because there are no environmental protection for what they do. For instance, the Norwegian company that did a massive destruction of Amazonia recently, contaminating the whole river, is the same company that respects strictly all the Norwegian environmental laws when it is operating in Norway. But when it operates in Brazil, it doesn't care. So you see that the investment here is an idea of the colonial degradation of the other. So even if Brazil has also environmental laws, but they don't respect them. They are based on the idea of immunity and therefore impunity. And therefore they can do whatever they want. So very often the forms of investment have embedded in them colonial prejudices. And sometimes also patriarchal prejudices. It's a region where the woman dominates the economy because it's a matriarchy region, for instance, some regions in Mozambique, or is a patriarchal one. These things changes the investment. So they have all kinds of prejudices there. But we have to analytically distinguish them. And it is not easy. We have to have instruments to analyze case by case. But it's a very good question, quite frankly. The second one, on decolonizing becoming imperialist, I think you are right. I mean, you are right that as such as the discourse is still talking about decolonization in an institution that separates knowledge from the practice, is very isolated from the community outside. So we reproduce that. What we are doing, in a sense, is to prepare, in my view, as I see my task, competent rebels. People that are going to struggle outside the university. I mean, the academic debates are minimal compared to the debates, the conflicts outside the world. The moment that the epistemology of the South become a title of a course in this university or another university, I'll abandon the term, because that's the corruption. It has been co-opted. That's why I say that I spend 50% of my time with social movements, because the transformation has to come from outside. But the university plays a role in this. The university cannot wash its hands and say, well, I have nothing to do. I'm a center of knowledge. No. It has a responsibility to be there. But it's going to produce a different type of intellectual in the future. We tend to see, for instance, our professor was saying that very eloquently. Why do you know so much? We have so many theories, and things go wrong more and more. And it is interesting, because we have this separation between theory and practice. No peasant makes that distinction, but we do. And you know what happens? When the practice goes wrong, it's never the theory's fault. The theoretician keeps his job as university or wherever it is, or leader of a party, the same. The fault is all on the practice. The theory is about. No, it's not. We have to create rearguard intellectuals, academics. You know what a rearguard is? One that is behind the social movements. It's not ahead of them, but behind. Because in the movements, in society, most people are about to give up the struggle. The suffering is so high. This lack of alternative is so prevalent that they give up very often. And I think that we, in our society, in order to survive, we need really two emotions that are absolutely central to have a kind of a balance between the two of them. Fear and hope. We need both. Because we have to be fearful of certain enemies, of course, right? But we have lots of people in the world that have no fear. The super rich, they have no fear. They seem to be above law, above everything. If there is a problem of pollution, well, they buy an island in the Pacific Island. And as long as the island is still afloat, they stay there, right? And if it goes under with the climate change, they move to another one. They have no fear. But most people in the world today have no hope. That's I see the signs everywhere about the depression of students. I was surprised in Joburg when I saw signs all over the place. For depression, call this number. What is depression? It's because we are trying to have the students accommodated to a very unjust system that supposedly did away with the apartheid and is repeating it under new forms. And nobody talks about that. Nobody talks here about the land issue, for instance. Can you believe that 3% of the population has 97% of the land in this country? That's quite a concentration. But you are from Zimbabwe, and you know that people in South Africa have the ghost of Zimbabwe. You cannot repeat Zimbabwe. And believe me, even though I was critical of Mugabe, Mugabe did the right thing. He was forced to do that. Because you know probably the Lancaster House Agreement had a clause that said that the UK would pay for land redistribution. And they never did. And he waited for 30 years. And then did it in the worst possible way to combatants and former combatants and so on. It was lots of corruption. But at least in Zimbabwe, we have a great expert on land issue. That tragic was a good friend of mine and died in India recent, Samoyo, with the Center on Land Issues. In South Africa, I've been looking around. Most universities have no study group on the land issue, even though it is the time bomb of South Africa. Only at UCT, I know there is a group that is working on this. And then they ask people, they say, well, there are not many experts on the land issue in South Africa because of the coyness that your professor just told you. So I think there are these things that we have to be confrontational in a sense. It's not the university that is going to solve. The university has to contribute to the change, be part of the change. But it's not going to lead. The struggle is outside, right? If students are here, of course, we can have students in the same classroom. Some are hungry because they couldn't eat. Some arrived at the university after 1-2 hours of transportation. Others came, their own parents brought them into the universities. Some asked the professors. I was in Bloemfontein last week for the Zotel conference. Zotel is a scholarship and learning teaching association of South Africa. And it was created by a dear friend of mine that passed away, Brenda Leibovitz. And that's why I postponed my visit for 1 year. And the questions there were sometimes horrifying. Lectures are with the students in front of them, but they are evaluated by global metrics. Do they pay attention to the global metrics or to the concrete students that are in front of them? Some of them ask the professors, what is writing? Because they really don't know how writing becomes so important, and you have to write in which way you have to write, which is the style. And we are talking about people at the university level. because sometimes the the school didn't do probably the proper job, right? So these are the questions that the people are discussing. But the university has to play a role in this. But of course, it's a political process. Lemoning, I liked your question. We know each other for a long time because she was in our summer school 2 years ago, right? That's last year. Right, that's right. So, and it was a good experience for you. It was for us having you. And we have been discussing these questions that she's very much concerned with, this question of language. Because I'm not speaking my native language, I'm speaking English. My native language is Portuguese. And I write poems sometimes, but I would never imagine write a poem in English. No, because it is too deep. It is necessary to know the language at a given level that may bring out the most complex issues in life. Well, now compare with many students for whom English is not the first language. So it's a form of colonization, of alienation in a sense. Because my discussion with Mogoba, dear friend, in Wits was that how impossible it is to render in English the word Ubuntu, the concept of Ubuntu. And he went on in his own language to try to explain, for surprising, of many people that could not follow, myself included, the complexity of this concept. And then he kindly translated some of it. But he knew, and we knew, that it was a translation. And therefore, a treason also of the deepest, particularly the sacred side of things disappears. There are things that are too intimate to a culture to be able to be translated. So that's the problem. I deal a lot with the intercultural translation because we have to deal with relative opacity. We never understand the other completely. And the problem is that the one that dominates the dominant knowledge can afford not to understand. Well, it's irrelevant what we are saying because he doesn't or she does not understand. But the person that is on the other side cannot afford to be misunderstood and is misunderstood all the time. So that's why education is to a large extent miseducation today. And if it is miseducation, all of us should be re-educated. Is the university ready for a large project of re-education? That's the question that you have to raise. But language is, of course, crucial. The fourth question is also very important. Yeah, that's the dilemma of these things. We pray to the converted. And the people that there are two kinds of people that probably would be involved in our discussions and are never involved. Those that have too much power and those that have no power. Most people that could benefit from my lecture are not allowed to come in, to enter the university. The majority of people. They are the ones that probably will understand what I was saying about other knowledges because that's the only one that they master, and they are really very proficient in that knowledge very often, but they are not here. That's why the sociology of absence is so crucial in my study. I'm always asking, who is not here? The people that are missing. The topics that are missing. That's what we should be doing. Because you always take whatever we say as the only relevant thing. We are living archives. In fact, in that book, I have a chapter on the archive, because the archive is very treacherous. Because whatever is not in the archive does not exist. But the archive is the archive of the colonizer, of the guys that wander. The guys that lost. They may have registration of bodies, the ships, the slave ships, and so on, but nothing about their lives. Because most of that knowledge is oral. It's not written down. That's why a great philosopher of this continent, Valentin Boudimba, wrote about the colonial library. Right? And you can read that book, and in fact you can, In that project, I don't use PowerPoint, so I can't do this, but I give you the card here. I ran a very large project in Europe called Alice in the Wonderland, Alice project. Alice, and you go and you get all this. And it is in English, a page is in English, in Portuguese. And there are conversations of the world. And I have 2-hour conversation, one with Mogobe Ramosa and the other with Valentin Mudimbe. This conversation with Mogobe was in Freedom Park in Pretoria. And with Elizabeth Mpof was in Harare. So, and people from Mozambique and so on. So I think that you are right. But what is your responsibility? Your responsibility, take the message outside. Work with your people, your chess club, your rap club, your hip-hop culture club, whatever. Talk to them. That's your responsibility. Don't keep it for yourself. Well, as the fifth question was a comment also that went in this direction of the people that are not here and the absences. I don't know if I got all the richness of your question, but I think that's precisely what I think, that in most cases, those that are not here are the ones that need most what we have to say. And I didn't know about the authorities, but the authorities really, they are listening to other things. Why the vice chancellors are so enthusiastic about the fourth industrial revolution? Because they go to thousands of courses run by the consultancy firms and by the other instruments of global university to convince them that this is the way for South Africa and for other countries. And they try to convince politicians that they can leapfrog in the future. So when you read the conditions, for instance, for a successful fourth industrial revolution are the following. I'm telling you from one of the papers. Social inclusiveness. There's not too much disparity, the inequality. Rural-urban balance. Access to credit. Reliable state regulation. Electricity grid complete. Access to internet almost universal. You know, the data in African jail, 22% of the people are connected to the internet regularly, which is very low compared to these things. So these are the reality checks that we have to bring in order to fight this type of discourses. I don't know if my colleague wants to comment.
No, fine.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Apio Bezan. Prof, on behalf of the Nelson Mandela University community, I would like to express our profuse gratitude for the lecture that you have delivered. I see that there are postgraduate students, and I could see that they are taking notes, and some are already working on their proposals. So, so essentially, the lecture was very enriching, and we are utterly grateful for that. I would also like to thank Professor Mutala for the contribution that he made. And in absentia, I would also like to thank Mr. Hashatze, who had to attend the award ceremony. We would also like to thank Professor Tsepo Madlingozi, who had assisted us, Krishet to secure the visit of Prof. Santos. Not forgetting our student community in George, and also the participants that are joining us via Skype. We are also grateful to them too. And also, the organizing committee from Krishet and SIPSET. We thank you guys, and I would also like to deviate from the standard procedure of omitting to thank the caterers. We also thank them too. Prof, We thank you once more.
Thank you.